Welcome to the Mind Enclave Theology podcast, hosted by Miriam Pease and Amy Patton, which come out of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health, and Disability.
We both live and work on lands that have been homes and remain homes to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Neutral, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples and other peoples who have cared for the land.
We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land and are mindful of the need to repair broken covenants.
This podcast is an opportunity to model how faith communities can engage in theological and spiritual conversations around madness and cripness.
If you need a full transcript, you can find our videos on our YouTube channel.
We want to say before we begin that topics and conversations we are raising throughout our time together are often hard.
They are hard for Mad and Crip people ourselves, and hard for our families and loved ones.
So do what you need to do to take care of yourselves, your bodies, minds, and hearts.
And now, here is our episode. Welcome to this episode of the Mad and Crip Theology podcast. We're delighted to have you listen or watch today, and we're delighted to have three of our contributors from fall 2021. I forgot the year issue of our journal. So, Amy.
Yes, it's that confusing time of year where you're not quite sure what year it is. So I totally understand. I think usually by March, April, we clue into what year it is. So I feel you, Miriam. So welcome. We're so glad we have three guests today, which is very cool. It's our first time having three people on. So we will do our best to manage the chaos, so to speak, as we're all here together. And what we're hoping we could do is start off with introductions from the three of you. If you wouldn't mind just letting us know your name and your pronouns, and then just your connection to the journal, how we know you. And finally, if you could just describe what you look like for our listeners, we would really appreciate that. So I think I'll just invite you one at a time. So Tori, would you mind starting us off?
Sure. So my name is Tori Mullen. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm based in Northwestern Ontario in a little tiny town called Marathon that has way too many United Church moderators. Too many. But I found out about the journal on Facebook in the United Church Facebook universe, which is very full of many posts. But I have had a secret theological crush on Miriam for a really long time. So so it's pretty exciting and to meet you, Amy, as well. You seem lovely, so do Susan and Larry. And to describe myself, so I'm a white non-binary individual. I've got short blonde cropped hair and horn-rimmed glasses. I think I balance the kind of like chic but also cute look, if I was gonna, put a word to it.
Definitely very chic and cute. Thank you, Tori. And Susan, can I invite you to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks, Amy. And hi, everyone. My name is Susan Smandage. I go with pronouns she and her as well. I am a postulant, which means I'm a priest in training with the Anglican Church of Canada. I just finished my MDiv with Trinity College back in August last year. And a couple years ago, I wrote a paper about Job, and one of my professors said I should like consider putting it forward for an article for a journal, and that was a nice idea. Didn't really think much of it at the time, and then I think I also found out about this journal through Facebook. I think it was through probably the Toronto School of Theology Facebook site. And yeah, that's how I came to know, at least virtually, Miriam and Amy, and a pleasure to meet Tori and Larry today. What else? My connection kind of to mental health is that I have a lived experience of PTSD and moral injury. And in terms of describing myself, I am also white, female. I also have short, kind of brownish hair. A little bit messy today. It's the COVID hair. When I'm working at home, it doesn't really matter. Usually I wear glasses, but not right now. Yeah, and I said to Amy and Miriam and the folks, I might have my cat Clifford joining us at some point during this podcast. If there's meowing, it's not me, it's him. Thank you.
We are very excited to meet Clifford at some point. And Tori, what's your kitty's name who we can see behind you?
This is Ravi, or Ravioli Mullen, full name. A very distinguished gentleman and theologian.
Yes, amazing. Okay, and Larry, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Larry Schneider. I think I'll start collecting old age security in about 4 months or so, which is going to be a shocking experience. I'm short, with white hair, a white goatee, and dark rimmed glasses. I heard about this again through the United Church website or Facebook. I don't exactly recall. I have known Miriam for 11 years already. We started our journey in the Masters of Divinity program at Emmanuel in 2011 in a large class. I think we're at the start 18 of us in the group, which really provided a very strong, support network. So I was ordained in 2015, worked in full-time ministry in Dorchester, Ontario for 2 years. And then my congregation came to me and said, there's something wrong with you, Larry. You need to stop. And I did. And I didn't know, but I had a benign growth in my brain. And it was called white matter. It took over, like, really, that's the rear half of my brain, resulting in, significant brain damage. At the time, I was suffering from abdominal pains and illnesses and had sought answers, didn't get any. So just before I went into hospital and had a biopsy of my brain done, I was diagnosed with stage 4 liver disease, which resulted in bloating, my brain being, sorry for the term, marinated in toxins, until exactly 3 years ago, in February 2019, I had a life-saving liver transplant, because I called the family and said, things are not looking so good here. So I consider the fact that I'm alive a miracle. My mind, knowledge, skills, so on, were decimated, and we can talk maybe more about that some time later. So at present, and part of my emotional state is I'm not allowed to work. I'm on long-term disability, which the church thinks is that they're doing me a favor, giving me a pension to not work. Within months after the transplant, I wanted to work. I was sure I was going back to ministry. I didn't have any language. I couldn't talk. I couldn't swallow. I couldn't walk. But I'm here. Miriam and I were chatting earlier, and I said, I feel amazing. And I pinch myself every day to see that I'm here. So it's a pleasure to meet all of you and to have read the pieces the others have written and to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Larry. We're so glad that you're here today.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I think Miriam's got the first question for us today.
Yeah, and this question is for Tori. So in your cute for Tori. So in your author's note, you talk about the connection your faith community made between mental health struggles and lack of faith. Can you expand on this and talk about how your understanding has transformed from that theodicy? And when after that, can you read us your poem?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So folks who know me know that I grew up in an evangelical Christian community. I was actually a Mennonite Brethren community in Nova Scotia. And the interesting thing about that particular group is they experienced a lot of miraculous healing within the community. And in the poem, I allude to, but don't specifically say until the author's note, my mom died when I was a teenager. And she was the first person in that community who really didn't experience a miraculous healing. And it was quite devastating for them. It was about 16 years of that church plant existing and people being like truly miraculously healed of all kinds of minor to quite major life-threatening conditions. So it feels very natural to say, you know, okay, a strong faith community, a strong prayer life, healing is the solution. And I love how, as my faith has grown, you know, we talk a lot about like healing versus cure. So it was a very curative kind of faith that any kind of bodily illness, any kind of mental health illness was seen as part of the fallen world, part of, you know, sin embodied around us. And there was also just this really clear sense that, like, if you could just if you could just, aren't those the famous last words? If you could just believe hard enough, pray hard enough, read the right things, talk to the right people, you'd be fine. And of course, I think as many people with depression, I hit puberty and experience an incredible amount of emotional and existential angst, which sometimes when people are younger, it's like, well, is this just growing pains? Is this a phase? It's really hard to put a name to it. And we know that depression in teenagers is really complicated. But I remember trying to express those feelings to this faith community and having like trusted adults say things like, oh, you use the word depression. Don't use that word. That's a really big word. And like, you shouldn't use it. Yeah, so it took a really long time for me to even get to a space where I could envision like that it would be okay to be depressed and be Christian. And exactly the same thing as with my sexuality. It wasn't until I saw people ahead of me in their life who were queer and out and Christian and were depressed and out and Christian, and they just fully accepted their full selves. And it's amazing. I didn't know until last spring that my mom had a serotonin deficiency. And that's when I wrote this poem, which is really a love letter to her and to myself, like a piece of grief work of, I don't know if when I was 14, if we could have sat down and said, I love Jesus and I'm also depressed, and apparently so are you. And been able to have that, not just the experience of seeing someone ahead of me, but someone who like is so much like me. I am made in the image of my mom. People stop me on the street and say, hey, are you Susan Mullins' daughter? I went to university with her back in the 90s or in the 80s. Like, oh my gosh. Okay. Like my face is her face. And so just that idea of being able to sit with her and share these experiences. Like, you know, there's always that wonder of, could I have got into a safer place faster? Could my healing have started sooner? Maybe I wouldn't even have to heal from some of these things that have hurt me because I would have just gotten there. And it's hilarious that it was easier to come out, and it was easier, you know, to tell my family that I'm queer or to come out as non-binary than it was to publicly say, I live with depression. Currently, I take medication for it, and it's been life-changing, and I regret that I hadn't done it sooner. But even that step, right? Like, okay, I'm depressed, and I see a therapist. And then you have to wait a little bit. Like, okay, I'm depressed, and maybe I can talk about it. And then you go another step and say, oh, okay, I'm depressed, and maybe I'll take medication. Like, it's like a continual coming out over and over again. Yeah. And I want to talk about Susan's stuff so bad, but I'm going to wait. Because it really resonated.
And we wondered if you might read your poem for us.
Yeah, let me pull it up. So I wrote this poem in the spring of 2021, and it's called A Wish. I'm learning about you from the shadows you left on my bones. Lines and arcs I didn't even know were there until I peeled skin back to see what pulsing hurt was gripping me. If I had known when it began, when you were still alive, I might have asked to sit side by side, comparing, pulling back inch by inch the soft flesh covering us to see deeper into who we are. Instead, I felt ashamed and covered this aching body with molding leaves, banishing myself from a garden of self-love. Instead, I punished myself for being weak, for being human. I had no idea that other feet had walked before me down this same packed earth, hating every inch of flesh and scratching at their skin, scraping back the dermis to see what aching hurt held humanity in common. I so wish I could see your bones white and stark against pulsing muscle and veins, to touch, to see how it hurts like my own gentle body, to feel the bare grip of your arms around my torso, the wet trail of your tears down my skin, held in a hug I'll never have again, whispering questions and holding breath for their answers. Instead, these shadows on my bones, their reasoning is kept concealed. I am impatient and desperate for the doling out of our common history, a spoonful at a time, family secrets kept tucked away in tins like expensive treats. And I so wish I could ask to sit side by side comparing, to see clearly your echo in the shadows on my bones.
Wow, such a powerful piece, Tori. I wonder how you feel about that poem now, and how you felt about sharing that grief with a wider audience.
Yeah, it's funny, when I submitted the poem to the journal, I didn't want my dad to read it. And yet I was willing to submit it to a journal. And it's not to say it's a comment about your readership. But I did kind of have to get to a place of saying, like, would I be okay if people from my church, you know, I minister in a small congregation, but they're capable of Googling. Would I be okay if they read it, and how would that make me feel? And yeah, I mean, it's there's such a vulnerability in talking about your mental health struggles, especially when your profession, you know, especially when it has to do with your profession. And I think Larry will likely talk a little bit about that later on. But, you know, especially because I'm ministry personnel, I want to be open. I want to model vulnerability. I want to model, like, just God's grace in the midst of our humanity. But then the stigma is so real, and the anxiety and fear is so real. But I've gotten a really incredible response from people. And I think especially with COVID, so many people are accessing mental health services, are taking medication, are realizing that, like, they were in a situation that was sustainable but not good. And with the pandemic, it's no longer sustainable. And they're kind of coming face to face with that fact. So maybe it's just the environment. Like the stigma is certainly there, but people are so receptive right now. But I don't think I'd read this poem to my grandmother because like there's still, it's complicated, especially with family history stuff, like that line about the tin of treats. I'm sure many of you have a memory of like the tin of treats your grandmother would bring down and like dole out the one quality street candy. Some of my family history feels a lot like that. So it's complicated.
Well, Tori, we feel like your poem was such a gift. So thank you so much that you shared that with us and with our readers. And thank you for reading it. I love listening to people read their work. It's just so beautiful. So thank you. We wanted to ask Susan some questions about the paper that she wrote for the journal. And this was about Job, for those who haven't had a chance to take a look. And Job has always fascinated me. And when we saw your paper come in, Susan, we were very excited to see that you were doing this work. So we wanted to ask you, first of all, why did you pick Job? What was it about him that you maybe found some resonance with or some connections and you wanted to dig deeper?
Well, thank you for that question. It was kind of an interesting timing. So I was taking a course on wisdom literature at Trinity in the spring of 2019. And of course, Job is part of the wisdom literature. And I was kind of like, oh, I guess I'll have to get through it. I've always kind of, I think, avoided Job because I found it so dismal and I found it quite depressing. And it's like, oh, do I have to read that book again? Like, so it's kind of like not looking forward to it. But then the big focus of the course was on Job. We had to basically read the whole thing, analyze it, do different exegesis of it, so on and so forth. And I had like a sort of, I don't want to use the word epiphany, but kind of an epiphany of like, oh my goodness, there is a lot in this book that is hitting me. In March of that year, so about 2 months before I took the course, I had been diagnosed with PTSD and kind of suspected to have kind of moral injury as well. And as I was reading the book of Job and like reading it in detail and going back and forth on the chapters, there was a lot of kind of like almost like suspected. I'm like, oh, maybe Job had PTSD from all of his adverse experiences in terms of losing his livelihood, losing his family, and physical injury and so forth. And it really started to kind of resonate with me, thinking, and it kind of links to like Tori's point, like if you know somebody, either in person or somebody kind of a biblical character or another figure that's gone before you on a path, then you can kind of go, yeah, it's not just me. I'm not the only person that has experienced these kind of emotions and situations. And oh yeah, like he did make it out the other end. And yeah, it wasn't a very necessarily a pleasant trip or a pleasant journey that he followed. But it really started to inspire me and to kind of resonate with, oh, my experience is not like a one-of. Other people have experienced similar things. Obviously, I didn't experience what he did, but like kind of the similar kind of behavior, actions, implications. And it kind of started to give me like a glimmer of hope. And I thought, like, through doing the paper, I'm very kind of type A. So I like to like analyze things. My background's actually in engineering. So I like to kind of get into like a book and analyze it, do like a nice exegesis. And I found almost by doing that exegesis of Job, I could externalize and kind of study PTSD from the inside looking out, like if somebody else has it. So I'll study Job and analyze him and analyze the book. And I could start to understand PTSD on real terms. So to externalize to understand. And then that kind of helped me to almost find like a safe space to like start to internalize it, saying, okay, that's Job and PTSD. So how about me and PTSD? What does it mean to me? What is my lived experience? And then to kind of almost kind of like kickstart the healing process. So yeah, it was kind of a weird kind of timeline or part of my life, but yeah, it kind of brought kind of a resonance and kind of a start on the kind of road towards healing.
Yeah, and for listeners of ours who may not know the book of Job or may have heard his name before, but aren't quite sure what his deal is. So what happened to Job? Can you just nutshell it for us so people would understand why you think he would be a candidate for PTSD and moral injury?
Yeah, so he experienced a lot of trauma. So a lot of bad things happened to him. It was kind of like a bet that Satan made with God, saying, well, let's just test this guy to see how much he can take. So like he lost his children, he lost like all of his kind of assets. Started getting sores. He was physically ill. So basically anything dismal and dire and desperate kind of happened to Job. A lot of the book actually is about a couple of his friends, three of his friends, basically saying to him, well, Job, like, maybe you did some sin, like maybe you did some bad things and you deserve this. And he's like, no, I haven't. It was like him defending himself. So, there's trauma, like physically, that he was, physical and like cultural, and in terms of his material possessions, a lot of trauma of loss. But I think the moral injury part comes into it in terms of his friends basically assuming that he's done bad and he deserved what he got, and him having to continually kind of defend himself and kind of push back. And I think that's sort of, he knew he hadn't done bad, and he didn't think he was being punished for his apparent sins. But it's this kind of constant dialogue of kind of not being good enough, not having a strong enough faith, and therefore he was being punished. And I think it kind of, when you were saying, Tori, a minute ago, in your kind of introduction about your mom, like not having enough faith, therefore, that caused depression, or therefore she passed away. And it's like people make that assumption of, as a Christian, if you don't have enough faith, you don't have enough prayer in your life, then you have these dire results. And I think the book of Job just kind of calls that whole issue to the forefront, and actually shows how, kind of long story short, it actually deepened his relationship with God, and that it also kind of opened up, other conversations with his friends about how they consider like who God is, and that God is not a kind of a punitive God, basically. So that was a longer prior response than you wanted. Sorry.
Oh no, that was perfect. And it's not easy to like nutshell the book of Job. It's an epic book. So we wanted to ask you too, in your mind, what difference does it make if we understand Job as having PTSD? Like, why was it important for you to explore this idea?
I think it's really a lot to do what Tori is saying in her introduction, is that if you know somebody, or you know somebody, real or fictional or otherwise, that's gone down a path, it almost like validates or verifies or makes your situation like legitimate, and kind of helped me to kind of recognize first the situation I was in and kind of come to terms with it, and to be able to speak about it in practical terms and saying, I know he experienced this, I'm experiencing something similar. So it's to me, it's like, if we can recognize it in somebody else, then you can, I think, start to accept it in yourself. And that you don't feel like, part of my kind of trauma, and the reason for my PTSD is a very long story, but I felt very isolated. And I felt like I was the only person on the face of this earth that was going through this horrible experience. Obviously my experience is different than Job's, but if you're feeling that isolated, and kind of being an isolated and also being Christian, you feel like you don't belong to the Christian kind of body of Christ anymore. But I think having that, even though it's a biblical character, someone I could relate to, kind of gave me, kind of led me to a path of acceptance, and also kind of let me give myself permission to be who I was, and to feel the feelings I was having, without having to kind of stuff them deep inside or ignore them, or try to like justify them to other people.
Thank Susan. Yeah, Job offered the grace to be who you are. So thank you for that. And now we'll turn to Larry. And Larry, in your author's note after your poem, you write that we are all victims to the loss of hope because of the pandemic. And Amy and I found this as a provocative statement. So, and we were wondering how much we as communities and societies as churches and individuals gain hope back. And like Tori, we wondered if you could read your poem for our audience.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. I apologize for my excessive smiling. Now, I'm zooming in. We're in transit from our home southwest of London. We're at our grandson and son and daughter's home now, and I have an 8-month-old baby in front of me, over top of my screen, rolling around with his mummy and so on. So there may be a little chatter from him, but please, I apologize. Yeah, so I said, you know, we're all victims to the loss of hope. And I have empathized with the story of Job. Many of my religious and non-religious friends call me Job. My name's Larry John Schneider, so I've been teased I should really be Larry Job Schneider. So I think my 4 major episodes of PTSD. When I was a kid, I grew up on the idyllic existence on a farm in southwestern Ontario. And one day the farm was sold. We had a sale. All of our goods were gone. Many of my possessions were burned. And my favorite puppy, my German Shepherd dog, was killed because she could not move to where we were going. My father had developed ALS, Lou Gehrig disease, which, as you know, is an absolutely horrific disintegration of your ability to control your body and your muscles. So Dad died when I was 16. I was a very, very angry young man because I didn't understand. Nobody told me he was dying until the day that he actually died. So I was in shock. I think family thought they were protecting me. But it had actually the opposite result. I resented the loss of a farming career, of what happened to my dog, because it was my father who shot her. Fast forward to 1996, I had a horrific car accident. So everything from here, including my head and face, all my ribs on the right side and my foot and so on were shattered. So I have had multiple orthopedic surgeries, including having my right ankle fused just over a year ago, after which I fell and broke my arm. So I had my own little quarantine going on there. And then, as I mentioned, in 2017, I had the growth in my brain, and then concurrently the liver disease with the transplant. I lost hope. You know, I was ordained. I'd only begun my second career. My plan was to be at least full-time in ministry for a decade, for 10 years or so, which would have taken me to the age of 68. But the damage was very significant. As I think I mentioned, I was so keen to get back to work, but of course, I was not as capable as I dreamed that I was. I'd lost all my memory, and I did what to me seemed a good thing to do. I wrote a letter, published it in just a little small hometown paper saying, hey, I don't know who I was. I had like absolute amnesia, but who I was, what I'd done, what I'd meant to people's lives. So I knew I'd lived a life of service. I was a high school English teacher and then vice principal, supply minister through all of that time, supporting folks in all of my communities and so on. But that was all gone. And the worst part of the toxins was I went into an unconscious state. Some other part of my limbic system took over, and that was a really ugly, horrible man. So I lost my relationships with my family. I lost my memory. I lost the ability to move. All of my muscles atrophied. I was so sick, I just laid in a hospital bed for months. And then, like Job, the hits didn't stop. So the day I was supposed to leave the hospital after the transplant, I was diagnosed with shingles. Not much fun. And because I have a suppressed immune system, I catch everything. So I have had Lyme disease and West Nile. I don't know scientifically, but I suddenly developed arthritis in all my joints. I'm a guitar player. Miriam's heard me play the guitar and sing. I'm a singer with no choirs to sing in now. I can't entertain myself at home by playing. And if I sing a cappella, my wife goes, "Who stepped on the cat's tail?" So, so I was very depressed. I became very suicidal, and I had no hope. What did I have to hope for? And there was one shining star in that firmament, is that as I was going through all of this, our first grandson was born. So I say he is the star, and he now has a younger sister who just turned 1, and they have a cousin who's a young fellow that I'm just seeing now over top of the screen. We all have lost hope during the pandemic. We have all lost hope when we are damaged, when we've suffered huge loss in our life. I meet every 2 weeks with an amazing group of people. It's our local acquired brain injury group, and it's run through our local health center. They get it. They know that nobody understands what you're going through. They don't know what your life is. I say it's like I was going down the road and a freight train hit me, and my sense of reality gone. I cannot do numbers. I cannot tell time. I can't tell you, how, if I saw Miriam today, in 3 days, I may think, well, that was like a year ago that I saw her, which for social, and not that there's much social adventures right now, but with the family, trying to share memories. I remember being in a dinner situation before the pandemic, and the topic turned to travels on the East Coast, and everybody's chatting away. And I know I've been to the East Coast on 3 occasions, staying for long stretches of time. I couldn't say a thing. So that was a loss too, the inability to share and so on. I write a meditation and prayer every month for the online CASA group. CASA being, the Spanish for home. So it's our home church, and it's a variety of contributors from across North America. So I contribute on the 16th of every month. So usually I write some prose or more and more poetry. So this was the genesis of this poem. People don't want to hear about loss of hope. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about PTSD. I know my wife and my family all suffer from PTSD. And it's just occurred to me, like, as we've been talking just now, my family went through pretty much the same thing I went through. And then I went through it again when I was 14, 15, 16, and in the last 5 years. How can we gain hope back? That's tough, because the big things that I would hope to do, I can't do, but I'm very busy right now. And this is the first. So last Sunday I preached my first full service in front of a live audience, very small because the people are on streaming, in 5 years. And I'm going to do so again on Sunday. Tomorrow, Saturday, we're on the road. I'm going to do my aunt's funeral and so on. So being given the opportunity to do something in your limited fashion. Our classmates have been at Emmanuel have been amazing. So Lawrence, whose birthday it is today, Miriam, is at a church in Brantford. So when he was on holiday, he invited me. So I did the Zoom sermon. I didn't have to somebody else did the service. I came in, our friend Cheryl Bolton, she invited me to come, and we did a skit together live in her church before the pandemic. So the support of the community, the prayers, the people who prayed for me was amazing. That all of this, gives me hope. My faith, although it was bludgeoned and battered, has never waned. I don't say it waned, and it certainly hasn't gone. And I won't say I've clung to it. I've just had comfort at all times, even at my most down and depressed. that God was there with me. My friends all say, well, Larry, God was not done with you, and you're still here for a purpose. So I'm rediscovering the purpose. So one of the things I'm doing is I'm writing a lot, and I've got 2 columns to write for our local paper. And it's all about rebuilding hope, rebuilding a community. The next piece is a 2-parter on gratitude. So I made it my task to rebuild our community. And the second column is about the local businesses. We have 6 new local business owners in our villages. The reaction, because people don't know anywhere, they haven't seen anyone, they haven't done anything. If you don't have that social connection as human beings, you just go, whoa. So baby step by baby step, hope can be renewed or rebuilt.
Thank you, Larry. Could you read your poem for us?
Sure. I'll cover up my camera here with it. I called it Musings. Musings is one of my favorite words. It's just, sort of random thoughts that bubble up. My wife thinks that too many ideas bubble up, and I verbalize them. Musings on a turbulent time. A poem. Contortions. Exasperation. Anxiety. Fears. Prayer. Isolation. Rejection. Masking my face. Thoughts. Worries and losses. Stillness. Both willed and enforced. Smiling. Unseen. Crying. Unknown. Pleading. Unanswered. Indecision. Misinformation. Falsities. How can I persist, resist, exist? Seeking a calm place. Introspection. Meditation. Speculation. Realization. Acceptance that I am not unique or unloved or alone. God loves me, us, we, my neighbors, in the midst of calamity, loss, and confusion, always, in all ways, in unending ways, forever. This too shall pass, and we are charged with remaking love, community, our wounded selves and others, countering fear, prejudice, poverty of iteration, iteration, forgiveness of ourselves, others, our communal failings to strengthen hope, peace, trust, love, to rekindle joy in every healing heart, immersed in the wholeness that is God.
Thank you so much, Mary.
Yes,
My
thank
pleasure.
you so much, Larry. We felt when we received your poem, just as when we received Tori's poem, that it was a beautiful gift. So thank you. And now we've come to the point in the podcast where it's I think it's our favorite part, where we get to ask you all to talk to one another about each other's work. So what I think we might do is maybe we could invite Tori to start first. And if you have any reflections or questions that you'd like to ask Susan or Larry, please do.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm not sure how to pronounce the author's name. It's Grimmel or Grimmel?
I don't know either, actually. I just call it Grimmel.
Okay. So in Susan's piece, there was this fantastic quote from Grimmel, and I'll just read it for you. It says, connected to a timeless community of warriors, Susan suggests that those who suffer might benefit from that. And I've been thinking a lot because a really powerful image for me in my grief work with my mother is an image that a mentor offered me of thinking about my prayers rising like incense to join with those of the saints. And so it was this idea of my mom still, although physically not present, being a timeless part of my life. And especially as I'm on this new journey around my mental health, you know, which is also like a journey I'm on with her, although she's not bodily here. I just was so struck, Susan, by that image of that timeless community. And I loved some of the stuff you brought out in your reflection, just about being able to see those images of people before you, finding the Jobs, finding the, I'm often struck by Naomi in particular from Ruth and her journey of, you know, despair to joy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I really like Gurmel's work. It's quite challenging. Like, he's very technical in terms of how he writes, but yeah, the whole idea, like the kind of continuity, the continuum of the community of saints, like the body of Christ. I actually preached on that in November on All Saints Day. And it was interesting because there's a guy who was baptized that day as well. And it was just so beautiful, even this whole like crazy pandemic time, just to realize who's gone before us, who's with us now. And also know that there's the eternal hope as well. So that continuum, I think we can hold on to that. And to like Larry's point, like it's also like what can give us kind of hope is that we are part of that continuum. We can look backwards for examples of role models who have, you know, gone on a journey, and also in our own lives, in our own healing and our recovery, and just being so open about our situations. I hope and pray that we can be that kind of source of inspiration or source of like connectivity or interconnectedness or whatever you want to call it with people during this time as well.
Thanks so much. And Tori, do you have any other reflections or anything else that you want to offer to anyone here, or was that the main one that you wanted to share?
I mean, that was the main thing that stuck out. I will say that Larry, in your piece, and maybe it's because I was listening to it this morning while doing a discernment collage, which had kind of like one side, you know, had a lot of like blues and purples, and the other one had lots of like vibrant reds and orange and greens. And I was feeling like, because I use an accessibility feature on my computer to read me text. So I was listening to Siri read your poem to me this morning, and I was feeling this like tug back and forth. It felt very visceral.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that was intentional on your part, but it's certainly, I had a very bodily response to it, and I just wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, every day, as we know, is a journey all on its own, and each day has the highs and lows. You wake up depressed and frozen with the arthritis and stuff, and then you convince everything to get moving. You know, I've got a series of stretches that I do both for my body and for my mind, and it takes sometimes first thing, and I have a good day, and other days, well, but there are fewer of those days now. Thanks.
Thank you, Larry. And Susan, I wonder if you have any reflections or questions you might want to offer Larry or Tori.
Well, lots of things kind of sparked and kind of just got my attention in both the poems. And I guess for yours, Tori, I found it was, like, I read it a few times last night and then this morning, and then hearing you read it to us is profoundly intimate. And I feel like we have like a little glimpse into your soul. So I thank you for being so candid about your situation and the journey you're on. I also had a kind of visceral reaction to it. And it was, when I read it, again, I got the chills. And when you read it to us, I got like much more deeper kind of chills down my back. But the phrasing you had around scratching at the skin and scraping back the dermis, it actually reminded me quite a lot of Job like scraping at his sores. And it just felt, it's almost like that sense of like desperation and a sense of like self-punishment, or that kind of a desire to kind of rid oneself of what we perceive as impure, or that society perceives as impure or unhealthy, or and then the words you used around like shadow and whispering and concealed and shamed and covered, like it just, you're so eloquent in terms of describing in different terms, like the stigmatization of mental health. And I think that's such a rewarding and kind of such an interesting way to kind of frame it for people, and that people can kind of relate to that darkness or relate to that imagery. And I think the last one that really caught my attention was the phrase, the new edge of my grief. And I think that somehow that's sort of, I don't know, inspiring is maybe the wrong word, but to me, it's just an acknowledgement that grief or depression, it's not like a one and done. Like you grieve your mother's death and then that, then it's Tuesday and you're all over it. That's not how it is. And I think even just acknowledging that grief and healing and recovery, they're journeys. It's not a one-time thing. You can kind of check it off your list. I think that's really important for those of us who live with PTSD, and like maybe Larry can relate to this too, is that it's an ongoing kind of situation you find yourself in. You might be triggered some days, different things. Like I know a lot of my triggers, I know how to kind of respond to them, but then I get like triggered by something else. It's a whole new experience, a whole new thing I have to try to process and come to terms with. So that new edge is quite sharp sometimes, but the fact that you pull it out and acknowledge it was like really powerful for me when I read it, especially when you read it to us.
Thank you. And it's interesting because just thinking about sort of your perception of the poem and where I was when I was reading it, I've also just been thinking, Susan, while I read your piece, my partner lives with PTSD. He was diagnosed a number of years ago. So I've been on my healing journey with the depression, since I was probably 12 or 13, and PTSD has brought a lot of new mental health struggles for him, and something that we talk a lot about. And I even feel like maybe when I was stagnating a little bit in my grief work, because he's doing this work, which is its own type of grief work, that's been propelling me forward. And there's so much interesting stuff around, like I think of the word concealment, in the lines that you were pulling out, like this continual uncovering, and it's like deeply painful to do, but like it's also this like necessary thing, you know what I mean? Like, and it can feel so violent, and it's like this weird mixture of, and Larry's, that draw back and forth between like hope and I think about desolation and consolation. Let's just bring the Jesuits in here. Those highs and those lows. So I really appreciate the stuff you've brought out.
Yeah. Well, Tori,
Go ahead.
I had the same emotional response to your poem. Your turns of phrase and your imagery are like perfect and powerful. Shadows on your bones.
Yeah.
Like talk about like an ongoing permanent wound. Nobody can see it. You can't see it, but you feel it. Pulsing hurt was gripping me. Yeah, that's pain. It's there. It's unrelenting. And of course we punish ourselves. Part of what we all need to fight for is perspective. So initially you had no idea that other feet had walked before me. Well, that's very universal, the commonality of it all. When I read your note, then I realize, and I felt that this was someone very, very close to you, but yeah, we have, the humanity in commons. And I wrote, who is you? Who are you talking about there? I wish I could see your bones, white and stark. And I love this sequence. I'm impatient and desperate for the doling out of common history. That a spoonful of time. That reminds me of Macbeth. Tale is told by an idiot. You all know that, and that again, the shadows on my bones. So thank you. That was a gorgeous, gorgeous piece. And Susan, I was, as most people are very familiar with PTSD, moral injury. That's the first time I've heard that terminology. And it certainly resonates with me, that sense of anger and alienation and self-loathing. I was fortunate that I didn't have that. And I never blamed God. I never blamed myself for what had happened, because my liver disease was NASH, which means non-alcoholic. I had a wonderful diet and so on. But that alienation, I sort of felt like the corporate church was saying, Larry, you are broken and bent, and you don't fit into that, you're round now and you don't fit into that square hole, or vice versa. And they were right. But not, I don't, maybe they weren't as right as I think I am. But I must admit, I skimmed the latter half, but I want to go back and read it more because, as I said, I have this huge affinity with Job. So thank you for unlocking so much of his journey.
Yeah, it's a bit of a read. So I felt like I got the easy end of the stick reading short but incredibly powerful poems. And in turn, I have like about a 20-page article. So I hope it didn't take too much of your time. In terms of your poem, Larry, just this whole concealment, masking, like it kind of was a kind of a link between like Tori's poem and your poem about this like stigmatization. The word masking has almost become like it's a verb now, right? It's a very common term we have, like, are you masked? Are you not masked? Are you anti-masked? All that kind of stuff. But when I read the word mask in your poem, it was like, I always think masking is a physical thing. You're masking your face, you're masking whatever. But you said like masking, like you said, like your thoughts, your worries, your losses. And I was like, it's a whole different dimension for me. And it was, I've been thinking of it as like a physical protection, but now I'm seeing how like masking is also like a kind of mental health protection, like keeping it inside, concealing it to protect myself. And it just kind of caused me to pause and ponder, like, how much of a facade have I put on? You know, and it goes back to a point you made earlier, Tori, like as a minister, as kind of hoping to be, you know, God willing, ordained as a priest, like how much of a facade are we expected to have in that kind of vocational, in the ministry? Like you want to be vulnerable and genuine to your congregation, but there's also like a balance of self-disclosure as well, right? And I was like, fine to share my article, no problems with that. But then when I think Amy said, well, can you do like a little, like a brief about yourself? I was like, oh my goodness. I'm like, that took me, I think, far longer to write than even editing the article, like in terms of actually being open about my situation. And then when you turn near the end of your poem, there it says, we are charged with remaking love. Just the phrase like remaking love, it gives me like kind of the flutters as well. There's so much potential and invitation for hope. And even though it's been such a long pandemic and so much angst and so much tension and so forth, there's also this huge opportunity, I think. And I think that phrase, I think, will stick in my mind and my heart for some time.
Thank you all so much. We always have some contributors, since much of this work is personal. It's not over there. It's in our bodies, in our minds, in our hearts. And so we wondered what gives you energy to do this, to share this work with an audience, with your church, or with the wider community in the journal. And we'll start with Susan, maybe.
That's a really interesting and challenging question. I think for me, just like the candidness, like being candid and transparent and open, but within a kind of a safe space, kind of gives me the confidence to share. And I hope that by my sharing, other people will share as well and just know that they're not alone. So it's almost like kind of goes back to the kind of communion of saints energy about it. It's like there's an interconnectedness that exists. And sometimes we have to take the first step and be the one to share, to try to encourage others to do the same. And that kind of gives me energy to like, yeah, to go out there and to be vulnerable, basically.
And I wonder about your journey.
Yeah, the word energy, when I first read the question, when you said it ahead of time, I thought, oh God, do I have energy? But yeah, it's interesting. I think like part of it is sometimes you do the work so you can survive, you know, and that has its own kind of almost like feral energy to it. But then I also have this incredible kid who I look at and I just think like, you know, and it's like this with like gender and sexuality stuff. I'm so desperate to create a place where a 13-year-old kid who is just like drowning, you know, and cannot figure out a way out would just be able to find what they need to find a little bit sooner, you know. And again, it has that kind of desperate feral energy to it. It's not the like happy-go-lucky energy where you go, well, I get up, you know, 3 hours early every day and I meditate and I do my yoga and that gives me the self-care to do the work. No, my energy definitely comes from this like kind of like Magnificat, you know, Canticle of Turning, burn it all down, like sense. And it always feels really good to find, I see heads nodding. It feels good to find that communion of saints who are like, amen.
Yeah, amen to that for sure. And Lori, yeah.
Yeah, the inspire is one of my favorite words. As a English guy who loves language, I love to riff on that one because we inspire. That gives us energy. God inspires us. We expire, but we don't really expire because we go to be with God. We re-spire, respiration. We breathe again, again, and again. And we don't have any control over that. So God has inspired me. I don't have any control over that, but I love it. And I felt like a genie in a bottle. You know, went in this bottle, the cork was popped on. And so 5 years later, all fixed up physically, now mentally and emotionally, the cork, still mid-pandemic, has been removed mostly. So I can be who I had dreamed of being. And between that and the energy from my children and my grandchildren and my spouse and some of my close friends, I just feed off their energy, and I'm just burbling inside. And I'm happy to be here because I wasn't. This thing here, they tell me, stopped 2 times. So the miracle has happened. And I just wanted to share this in common with the other speakers that I too know of the cold of Northern Ontario. My teaching career started in Chapleau. I'll be going there to meet the students I started teaching 40 years ago in the summer. But today gives me energy. Speaking with other people, I love, unlike a lot of you, I love Zooming and FaceTiming with friends and my sisters. And there's nothing better than FaceTiming with your grandkids. That's just, anyway. So energy abounds. We've just, I guess, lost our connection to it.
Amen for babies.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for being here today with us. We really appreciate you taking your time out on a Friday to come and be here. And we're just wondering if there's any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners. Is there anything?
For me today, as I commented on the individual pieces, has just reaffirmed the universality of suffering. And one of the things that the current situation and our experiences of harm in our lives, it's isolated us. That is the worst thing we can do to ourselves. That's the worst thing we can do to our own society. As a former teacher who's worked with thousands of teenagers over my life, I see and I hear, I feel what this has done to them and children and adults of all ages. So we need to spring forward, and spring is coming, and hopefully so too will our lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Larry. And Tori and Susan, is there anything you'd like to share as we're heading off?
I just want to share I think I was delighted to be part and have an article I'll put into the journal. I think the journal is quite new, and I think it's such an important opportunity to it's an important platform that I don't think has existed to this point in time. and just to like look at the intersectionality of mental health and theology and so forth. It's such a critical thing, especially at this time. I think it's, I don't think it's a coincidence that the journal was, came into being during the pandemic either. Has a really important purpose, I think. And the fact that you're hosting these podcasts, I think it just kind of reinforces that interconnectedness that like Larry was kind of alluding to as well. I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be part of this group.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Susan. And we hope that we're going to be able to continue sort of igniting some of these conversations and bringing people together to join in. So, and Tori, is there anything you'd like to add?
One of my favorite things to do is invite people to write chapters in my fictitious book, which is entitled Strategic Vulnerability. You are all invited to write a chapter in my fictitious book.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much again, everyone. And we hope that you enjoy your weekends and get a chance to relax.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been my honor. Yes.
Thank you so much. God bless everyone.
Yeah.